Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
Hey, Crime Redefined listeners. We hope you enjoyed part one of that fascinating interview with Martín Flores. We're now presenting part two, and at the end, as we always do, Dion and I will give our breakdown of the entire interview. So enjoy, and thank you so much for listening. I want to do a little bit of gang 101 for our listeners here again. And I want to start maybe perhaps at the top. Let's talk about the Mexican Mafia and exactly what they are, how they started, and what they control and what they do.
Fact from fiction.
Right. So, first of all, the Mexican Mafia is a prison gang. There's a lot of misconceptions. People think Mexican Mafia, they think all Mexican gangs fall under the Mexican Mafia. They think Mexican Mafia controls all gangs in Mexico, in the United States, and so forth. So it's a prison gang that started in some could say, late 50s, when some Mexican American youth were incarcerated in a juvenile facility, and they came together, kind of developing a group to protect themselves from others. And back then, they were the minority in the facilities. Then when they went to prison, same thing. They identified a bond, and they established themselves as a group and stood their ground. Anyway, so the Mexican Mafia became a group, basically a prison group that primarily functioned in prisons and primarily dealt with the realities of prison, survival in prison, if you will, and kind of building that group of protectors, because everybody had the groups. The blacks had the groups, the whites had the groups, and so as time progressed, you basically had Mexican Mafia was originally a group of Mexican American youth from throughout California. Then in 1967, if I'm not mistaken, or 65, don't hold me to the year. September 16th, there was like a riot that took place, like a conflict that arose out of two groups, basically what they call the farmeros, or the farm workers, which are primarily Northern California, and the Mexican Mafia, where they kind of broke off. Now, it's important to recognize back then, when there was a breakoff of Norteños or Nuestra Familia and the Mexican Mafia, you still had people from Southern California that joined Nuestra Familia and people from Northern California that joined the Mexican Mafia, right? So now you have a formation of two prison groups, Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia, right? Nuestra Familia now is primarily consists of Norteños. Norteños today are gangs from Northern California, okay? Mexican Mafia is primarily consists of the umbrella group called Sureños, which are primarily of Southern California.
What's the dividing line geographically in California?
I'm gonna break that down, because there is no dividing line, and I want to break that myth. They allege the dividing line is Bakersfield. Okay, now, so that's true to a large degree. Everything south of Bakersfield, in terms of Hispanic gangs, are Sureños. There are no Norteño gangs in Southern California. Okay, so south of Bakersfield, it is a fair statement to say that it's Sureño gangs that exist. However, north of Bakersfield, you have Fresno. So you have another group that got developed in the Fresno area that's called Fresno Bulldogs. They used to run Norteños, and they used to run Nuestra Familia, but they formed their own group, right? What's important to recognize is that you do have a presence of Sureño gangs throughout the state of California, in Sacramento, in San Jose, in Oakland, in the Central Valley, in small towns like Sanger, and so forth. So the alleged boundary is Bakersfield, but when you look at the pockets of Sureño gangs throughout the state, you can't say that's a boundary.
I see.
Right? You could only say that's a boundary that says there's no Norteño gangs south of Bakersfield. But there are Sureño gangs throughout the state of California, all the way up to the top, right? So that's where I challenge many law enforcement officers who have a limited scope of their geographic boundaries. If they're primarily an LA cop, they know the LA gang that they monitor, but when they try to articulate the structure or gangs throughout the state, they kind of fall in the trap. Bakersfield to the south, and they forget about Fresno Bulldogs, and then everybody's Norteños to the north. Well, that's not true. There's Fresno Bulldogs, I mentioned, and you still have Sureños that are throughout the state.
Martin, did you have any run-ins or do you have any knowledge of Danny Roman?
Yeah, I actually interviewed him a couple of times.
No kidding.
Wow.
Yeah, I met with him at Salinas, and I met with him. I met with Roman.
Do you mind sharing what was the reason for the meeting and what went on?
Yeah. So I can only share so much. Basically, I met with him to follow up. I had a client in Riverside County who potentially was going to have a witness testify him, which is Rene Enriquez. And I know Roman had things to share that would be helpful in challenging that testimony. So part of that conversation was kind of educating in terms of the front that Box Enriquez would have and the lies that he had in his books or the exaggerations that he presented, and kind of the perspective from the insiders that basically there are other reasons why he debriefed, and not just because he wanted to be a changed man, for example, but other reasons that Boxer wanted to debrief, such as that his life was in danger because it turned out that he had been a sex offender. It turned out that he had violated some rules. And so I think it was catching up. But from what I understand, again, I wasn't there. Can speak to what generally was conveyed, that basically that what he portrayed in the book was not an accurate representation of the people he mentioned. It was not an accurate representation of what he had portrayed himself to, had, chose as a reason to be a changed man, So that was generally the one of the purposes of meeting with him and other members. I've been to Pelican Bay and I've interviewed other members, won't probably speak too much of them, what I'm saying? But
understood.
Got it.
Yeah.
No, need to say more.
Yeah, we're only asking you actually, Martin, because we happen to we've done some studying on the whole, what you might call the Roman Empire and his daughter and all that. So we're just kind of curious if you were involved in that at all.
Spoke. No, I never worked this case, but we did have a conversation about his daughter, what I'm saying, and so he opened up in a personal basis, and it's the interaction was positive with him, right? I was received well, and the conversation I thought flowed, and it's tragic that he got killed, and I don't know details of those exact dynamics, but I want to say my interaction with him was awareness. I didn't feel that he crossed any lines. I didn't feel that he violated any of the internal rules. I felt that it was educational, what was factual to members, to people who knew about Enriquez and saw how things were just exaggerated or misportrayed from Box Enriquez to give this impression to a jury or to law enforcement. And they had a different perspective, and I thought that, that he definitely, he gave me what he could without violating their rules, at the same time, sufficient to understand how the defense could challenge this potential witness.
Of course. I'm hoping these questions aren't going to get you any more trouble, but I'm also just interested in MS-13 and again, kind of a fact or fiction type thing. What exactly are they, and are they really the threat to the U.S. that the media portrays them to be?
Sure. So I've done a lot of MS-13 cases, and just like most of the gang cases, you have a spectrum of young people that are involved. You have some that are hardcore and notorious killers, and you have some that are individuals caught up in the web of being at the wrong place, wrong time, or being recently in the country, hanging out with people they could relate to and having a social relationship, let's just say play soccer or school, and not realize getting caught up in bigger picture actions, right? So for example, had a youngster who would play soccer with the guy, and then they would go eat at a taco truck, and their friend told him, hey, get whatever you want. So order a burrito, order some food. Well, it turns out that the guy from MS that he was with was actually extorting the taco truck. So this kid got caught up for extortion because he went to the taco truck and ordered himself a burrito, and his homie said, get what you want, no big deal. Not knowing that the taco truck was being taxed, right? So when it comes to MS, it's important to recognize that Mara Salvatrucha was established in Los Angeles, right? Well, there's different stories, and I think it's important to be open-minded to multiple stories. There's stories that there was a presence of MS in El Salvador, but it wasn't MS. So there was kind of like a presence of like a gang-like presence in El Salvador prior to the establishment of MS, but it was never MS in El Salvador until it happened in Los Angeles. So in the 80s, when you had a lot of migration from El Salvador due to the Civil War, it brought adults and children, especially to the LA downtown Pico Union area. And so a lot of youngsters growing up got sucked into their environments, right? Their environments could have been the local gangs that existed. It could have been Clanton, 18th Street, Temple Street. So you had some Salvadorians, recent immigrants that may have joined those local gangs, and you had Salvadorians that were a unified front that had to face those different gangs, right? And so the story is that they formed a group initially to protect themselves from these primarily Mexican-American youth gangs that exist in the area that would take advantage of punk them or whatever they would do. And so they formed a group. The group was primarily into like rock music, so they would use the horns because that's how you rock that kind of music, right? So that was a part
maybe
of
the devil horn hand signal.
No, devil horn. The devil horn hand signal originally is more just for the hard rock music.
Right.
It was more for Slayer and all that. People would do it. So
Ronnie James Dio.
Yeah. So that sign was originally motivated by the music that they attracted themselves to.
Interesting.
And so as it became a gang, they maintained that sign, and now the horn is symbolic for MS, right? And different translations of devil horns, whatever you want to call it, right? So MS became, when they formed as a gang, I grew up in that era when they formed as a gang. I remember as a youngster, like, again, having that awareness of your environment, right? So we go to Tommy's in Rampart, and it's like, fuck, we love Tommy's, but it's risky because MSs are crazy motherfuckers. They were known to, like, man, have machetes or shoot people, shit that was kind of a little bit beyond the bar.
Yeah, that burger better be good.
Street gang. Yeah, but add extra chilies and cheese and pickles, please. You know what I'm saying?
Right, get the whole works.
get it before I don't make it. But so growing up, MS did build the reputation of being violent, and part of the reasoning some people say is because they were already exposed to violence in El Salvador during the Civil War. They've seen the violence, right, as kids.
Yeah.
And so to perpetrate that violence, it was for some. And again, it's important when we talk about gangs that not to paint them all with the same brush, and they're all the violent people, and they're all going to do the ultimate worst. Because there were some MS gang members that did commit those extreme violence acts and so forth. But not to say that every MS gang member had the same profile, right? But generally speaking, as a gang, they became a very reputable gang, 80s, 90s, and naturally then you fast forward to the 90s, now you're having deportations of individuals going back to all countries, to Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. And these are people from different gangs. Remember, some of the initial Salvadorians that came joined other gangs. They joined Temple Street, they joined 18th Street, they joined Canton. They joined a lot of those local gangs in the Pico Union, Westlake area, if you will, right? So when people started getting deported, these gang members that were primarily MS or a good presence of 18th Street or even Temple Street went back to their home countries of El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico, Guatemala. Well, El Salvador had a large population of 18th Street and MS. So when you go look at El Salvador today, you have the two largest gangs that have a presence in El Salvador is Mara Salvatrucha and Mara 18, which is 18th Street. And the majority of the formation of those gangs in El Salvador was because of the deportees that were sent back who were gang members, right? So when they went back to their home country, in this case, El Salvador, they began to formalize the gang, right? And it has now evolved to what they call a transnational gang, meaning that it exists in multiple countries, right? It exists throughout this country, throughout this country, right, in different states. So MS is unique in that it is one of those gangs that has spread to different communities in the United States and has spread to different countries, including Mexico, in Latin America, right? Especially in El Salvador, right? And so with that, you still have a continuous migration of young people. Some may have actually had roots of being members in El Salvador before they migrated. Some may have avoided the gang in El Salvador, and that's why they came to the United States. Now they come here, and when I say they, I'm not referring to all of them. I'm referring to those that get caught up.
Right.
Now, for those that came to the United States and they got caught up, they may have got caught up now because, again, that innocence of connecting to your group, your social group, meaning recent immigrant group, people that you can relate to, that speak the language and live in your area. And they may have just merely that social interaction, and by accident or default or circumstance, they get caught up in a jam.
Oh, what a
or
shame.
By labeling. What a shame.
Yeah,
because
how ironic.
Many of them, because I've interviewed many individuals in those circumstances that have been here short term and actually left El Salvador to avoid gang membership,
right?
And they get caught up in a jam here. And again, it's not that they got caught up because they wanted to. In most of those cases, they didn't realize their peer was involved in this level. And what I've learned is that because you don't ask your peer, what are you banging? If you're not banging, you're not banging, right? If you have a classmate who's your classmate and you want to get high, you get high. You don't ask them what you bang. If you got a soccer mate that you go play soccer on the weekend, you play soccer with them. You're not asking what do you bang, right? Unless they're showing their tattoo. So you don't really question these things, right? And so sometimes you end up, I got cases where people end up going, thinking they're going to beat up somebody, and next time someone gets killed, like, fuck, I was just here because I thought we were going to check this dude because he's an idiot. It turns out one of the persons in the group was an MS member, legit, and now they're all getting labeled as MS members, right? And now this was an MS crime, when in reality, it might have originated as just a personal beef.
Yeah, that's right? Actually a perfect segue to my next question. But Martin, can you talk a little bit about this idea of gang enhancements in prosecutions, what that does to potential prison sentences, and how things have changed in that regard, specifically in California over the last few years?
Sure. So gang enhancement has been a tool that was, I believe, implemented to address the gang violence that was taking place in the 80s and 90s. Because it was a war zone. LA was a war zone. Actually, throughout the country, you had people would describe it as war zones and gang activity. And I think the initial goal was to have this tool where basically somebody commits a crime, they had a gang enhancement that would deter people from wanting to commit these crimes. And so I'm sure it would deter someone like you and me who never want to get in trouble, right? But when people are caught up in this cycle of gang or violence, many times it's on the spot, spontaneous situations, and they get caught up in a jam, right? So there are planned acts where they may do a mission, they plan it, they're going to commit an act. And then there are circumstances where things just happen. Anyway, these gang enhancements became a tool with a very wide net. What I mean by that is instead of focusing on truly hardcore issues, hardcore gang crimes, and it became a way of labeling people. So now young people that grew up in these neighborhoods, I grown up in the era of the time the gang enhancements were kicking in. I would have been labeled as a gang member, a gang associate, because I lived in the gang area. I had friends who were gang members. I was, wore clothing that may have appeared, because the way you dress, it's up to older to judge you whether it's gang attire or not. You could wear skating clothes or tight clothes, or you could be gang attire, right? So I would easily fit the file, right? So now what you had is young people stopped by law enforcement. They were labeled FI cards, foot identification cards. And they were said, oh, you're in this area, you're a member. And many times I had it right, and many times I had it wrong, right? And so fast forward, this young person gets in a jam where now they are in a fight at a bar, or they shot somebody, or they stabbed somebody, or they robbed, they committed a crime. And now they look at the FI cards as a tool of identifying gang membership or association. Now these gang enhancements, the person would do time for their alleged crime, plus another 10 years or life, depending on what type of crime it was, with the gang enhancement, right? And so now what you're having in the 2000s is mass incarceration is taking place because of this new law. These gang enhancements basically were sending people to prison for life, 50 to life, life sentences, right? What may have been a 20-year sentence, now it's a life sentence. And there is basically, right? And these prisons are getting larger. These prisons are getting overflown. And now they're sending people to Mississippi and other states to deal with this population. And so for many years.
Or sorry to interrupt, but, and maybe also forcing bad plea deals as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you see your friends going down on these gang enhancements, and deal. The chances against you just based on the portrayal is that you're going to go down, because now you have this gang thing hanging over your head. So you're absolutely right. So many people, you're right, took deals and were sentenced to so many years, and they realized that these gang enhancements were really targeting Black and brown young people. It wasn't about Asians or whites or any other groups. The majority of people impacted by gang enhancements happen to be Black and brown, right? I think the number was something like 98% or 99% of the cases primarily involve Black and brown youth. So there's been efforts to change that. Some counties have made those efforts. LA County is one where they began at some point to get rid of the gang enhancement, or begin to minimize the implementation of gang enhancement, because even when it was publicly said that no longer gang enhancements, there are still cases out there where gang enhancements were still being held gang enhancements. However, the state of California has not fully changed. There are still many counties in California that still fully implement the gang enhancements. So the gang enhancement is well and alive in California. It's less alive in LA, but there's been other laws that have been implemented to try to address that gap where people are being overly prosecuted or racially prosecuted, if you will, in the sense of the type of time that certain populations are getting, right? So the new law that came in, it's AB 33, right? Which now they're supposed to prove the crime. And if proving the crime, if there's a gang enhancement, then they prove the gang enhancement. Before this law, they bring all the gang evidence in before even introduce the crime. here's the main name of the gang. Here are photos of the gang. Here are crimes of the gang. By then, the person's guilty without even introducing the evidence.
Yeah,
of
right.
the
What does the
crime.
jury do with that?
Right. So by then, we don't want these bad people out here. So guilty.
Yeah, if they didn't
So
do
now
this,
with
they
the-
must have done something else. So
They
just
must
get them
have
out
done
of here.
something, right? Yeah, absolutely. So with the new law, AB 333, now they got to prove the crime, and then if proven guilty, they prove the gang enhancement. But I've noticed that prosecutors are very creative, and so they still bring in gang evidence by saying motive, right? So it's supposed to be a new law to balance those scales and kind of make it more fair, so people get, if they get convicted of the charges, and if found guilty, if they get convicted of the gang enhancement, it goes through. But I've seen many cases now where, Your Honor, we're bringing in evidence, gang evidence, because it's motive, and sometimes it's totally warranted, and sometimes it's not. So we're kind of made progress in the sense that it seems to have been, the scales have been somewhat balanced to give people a fair shake of their case and the facts of the case. But it seems like creative prosecutors have found a way through motive to still bring in gang evidence in prior to convicting somebody on the actual charges.
Yeah, I guess you could call that being creative or disingenuous, depending on how
Whatever,
you look at it.
right.
Hey, Martin, what's your general opinion of the expertise of law enforcement gang experts?
Well, I think many of them, most people I've come across are knowledgeable in their field, knowledgeable in their particular street gang, because in most cases, they patrol that area, right? And I've seen people that are more knowledgeable than others. I see some where I'm saying, you've been there for 10 years and you don't know who the gang leader is? How is it possible? You've been there for 10 years and you haven't been able to interrupt the operation? How is it possible, right? So some of them, I think, I totally respect because they've done their homework. They're truly in the trenches. They know the people. They've done their job. Others have been blessed with the title of gang experts because they wear the uniform, right? And so they know gang culture, they know the area, but many times it's almost limited to that boundary. I know so-and-so gang member and so-and-so and so-and-so, but big picture, when they try to articulate the bigger picture, they just do a textbook kind of repeated story. Mexican Mafia this, and this is what they do, and the 13 stands for the 13th letter of the alphabet is M, and so it's almost like very petty. You could literally I could repeat what they're going to tell you right before they say it. I could be in the audience and say, blah, 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 blah. This is what he's about to say. Right, absolutely, right? So I wanted to answer your question, as there's some that I totally respect because they truly are knowledgeable in and out, of the multiple aspects of this thing called gang culture, not just your street level, county politics, state prison politics, big picture, right? So, and then there's others that I just say, man, this dude he's got a uniform. He went through academy, and truly he's given more credit, or she's given more credit than they deserve, right?
Like he technically knows more than a layperson, but the knowledge is not that deep.
It's not deep, right? And then someone like myself, who's not law enforcement, really has to make an effort to educate the jury and justify who I am and try to explain. And then I'm questioned, well, you don't patrol these streets, and no, I don't. And you don't write search warrants, no, I don't. And you don't arrest. And so it's kind of like only those people are the ones that can be considered experts, those that patrol the streets and write search warrants. And we got to recognize that there are true gang experts throughout the spectrum of our community, from people that are involved in social work, professors doing research, people that have personal family experiences, youngsters who are caught up in the streets.
Right.
People like myself who've been doing heavy work in the community. By no means do I think that I know everything. There's so much that I'm still learning, but I know a lot of the dynamics because of what I've been exposed to, from the LA area to the rural communities to the suburbs, and the different dynamics that exist in the prison politics, county jail politics in different counties. the juvenile halls, juvenile camps. So my exposure to being in these different environments have provided me a wealth of understanding. The number of people that I've sat down and interviewed for hours and learned from their stories gives me a sense of understanding, right? But I'm in a position where it's an uphill battle because I'm gonna wear a badge. And so the impression is that you are not as qualified as Mr. Badge over here.
Right. There's
and like
knowing
I said,
it,
I
and then
want
there's knowing it. Right.
Right. And don't get me wrong, there are some Mr. Badges that are excellent. They know their shit, be honest, understand, they'll break it down. And in those cases, I don't testify because I agree.
Yeah,
I
right.
agree with what he said. It's when they want to manipulate and try to reinterpret stuff and try to, change the name of the game where I would, hey, no, that's a lie. That's not accurate. That's not the way it works. Like, so it depends what I'm up against that I may consider say, you know what, this is a case you testify to because what that officer said is not consistent with what I got to say. Or sometimes it's like I said, sometimes it's very consistent or close to it. It's not even worth testifying because what I have to offer is not going to change that needle too much. It's pretty much along the same lines.
I was going to say, let's stay with this and talk to us what exactly your role and kind of like what a day in the life looks like as a gang expert in the criminal justice system.
Sure. Well, in my capacity, one of my primary roles would be to consult with an attorney. For some attorneys, they're new to the game of gangs and gang cases. So it's really just kind of taking the time to educate those introductory attorneys that are
sit them down, coach them up, so to speak.
The first gang cases, what to expect, and just kind of walk through that process. There's other attorneys that are very experienced and have gang cases, and they may need a particular articulation of an area, tattoo, interpretation tattoos, gang boundaries, rivalries, politics that exist, right? And so the next level would be to learn about the client, learn that story, learn that history, learn about the case. So assessing the case. I tell attorneys now, give me everything you got. I don't want to be unprepared. I don't want to be undermined. I don't want to be questioned about something because I did not read that report, because I did not watch that video, right? Or listen to that wiretap, right? So now I ask attorneys, give me those police reports, give me those gang intelligence, give me anything that's relevant. I want to listen to that proffer from the co-defendant. I want to listen to those jail calls because it's important that I get a more comprehensive understanding. You're never going to get the full picture. Nobody will, not their law enforcement gang cop or someone like myself, because there's always pieces missing. But at least I have a much more comprehensive understanding of a case. I've seen cases where a gang cop just walks up and just starts shooting off the hip and saying, well, this is a gang case because of this and that. Wait a minute, did you read any reports? Did you realize that this person has been in protective custody in his last incarceration? Did you realize that this person is no longer accepted by the gang? Did you realize? There's many things that people need to consider. And sometimes just the same generic BS is thrown out there and that is bought, right? And so part of my job is to analyze that and see where there's consistencies or inconsistencies. And if there are sufficient inconsistencies where it may make a difference, then attorney and I will decide this may be a case to testify. Sometimes those inconsistencies don't make much of a difference. So we'll agree that it's not the best time. And sometimes I'll just sit and observe trials, and I would help the attorneys with giving them questions to ask. Things that I may catch, they may not, right?
Well, Martin, I know you've got a lot of interesting cases and some high profile cases. And actually, sometimes you and I are on the same case.
Right.
A couple examples where, your expertise really profounded the impact of the results of a criminal trial.
I'm going to say there's been a few, right? And quite a few of them where we've had some circumstances where the defendant was found not guilty or the individual was found that the gang enhancement was found not true, right? Well, there's different ones. I think of an example of a kid who was on Main Street, and They were hanging out with some girls. They're from a different gang, and there was friends from other gangs in this vehicle. So this wasn't really about a particular gang. This was basically people from different neighborhoods that got together to get high, fuck around, cruise around, and they end up in another part of town where there's people or someone from 18th Street, and someone in the vehicle shoots at the person and kills them, and then they're trying to make this a gang case, in particular to the gang that my client was from, which was Diamond Street. And first of all, the sense when you have people in the vehicle from who would be considered from different gangs, you wouldn't go on a mission with different gang members who do not have a traditional record of doing that, right? So there are some cases where these two gangs get together, they commit these crimes, and I would say, well, in that circumstance, maybe it's true. But in this case, the evidence showed that, at least the evidence so I saw showed that these people were kind of more in a social capacity, getting high, drinking, and somebody in the vehicle was shot. And conveniently, the females pointed the finger at my guy, and it turned out that the evidence kind of showed more that maybe one of these females was more involved because she had more motive, right? And so part of my job was really to educate the jury of the inconsistent statements that were being given, right? About gang boundaries, about rivalries, right? For example, there was no documented rivalries in a long time or history between Diamond Street and 18th Street, for example, having a war going on, conflict, especially during this time frame. And so just kind of putting that history in perspective, articulating social media text messages and videos and photos and educating the jury about what that meant, right? And that's all I could do. I'm not there to necessarily to get a not guilty or found not true. I'm there to provide information that a jury could work with, and that they, along with everything else in that trial, along with the articulation of the attorney's representation of the case, along with other witnesses, that the jury can make a better decision. But when I think about that case, I say, wow, had someone like myself not stepped in, they would have bought the sole narrative that was presented to them by the prosecution.
Yeah.
Which is that this is what this gang does. All they got to do is say it. A gang cop could say, well, 18th Street and Diamond Street, and no one, they're not held accountable to the word. We are, as defense experts, because our paperwork follows us. You know what I'm saying? I can't say one story today and change it tomorrow. It needs to be consistent.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So, and most of these gang cops, I've seen inconsistent testimony, but they're still an officer, right? They're not really grilled on their inconsistent statements, Whereas someone like myself, they'll try to find transcripts. And I testified over 250 times. And thank God, the discrepancies are so minimal. It's like, well, you said this. Yeah, but look at 3 pages on the road. I actually said this, right? So they try to pinpoint me on something that was said without fully following the transcripts, where I give a complete statement of the scenario.
Yeah, the full context.
So, yeah, exactly. So that's kind of, I would say my work is really consulting attorneys on cases, meeting with the clients, interviewing them, understanding their story, looking at the discovery, finding areas where the prosecution is kind of positioning their case, see if and how my role can play a role, whether it's just consulting, whether it's testifying or writing a report. And if it does result in me testifying, is do the best I can to educate the jury so they can make a sound decision based on everything that they've listened to.
Martin, I recall some years ago that one of our colleagues, who's also a gang expert, had a situation. I don't really know all the details, but long story short, I believe law enforcement actually searched his office, went through some of his records under this premise that somehow they thought he was involved in some criminal activity just because of the people that he was studying and interviewing. I'm just curious if you've ever had any kind of similar experience where maybe law enforcement is maybe harassing you, or at least throwing a lot of hurdles in your way.
Yeah, thank God I haven't had that extreme level of harassment where homes are searched and are taken and things. I've always had this sense of the same cautionary growing up, right? Knowing where you're at, watching your back, a cautionary, in this field, because I'm dealing with cases where the prosecution and law enforcement has worked months or years preparing for those cases. And then here I am saying, no, you've got it wrong. Here I am challenging their narrative. So I many times have felt the risk of prosecutors wanting to go after me beyond the scope, right? Or the risk of detectives or law enforcement wanting to go after me. I've never had the direct hit like that, but I've always been cautious of that, especially when I felt that what I have conveyed in testimony may have seriously challenged their evidence and may have thrown a wrench in their case, right? Because at the end of the day, they're human beings, and it almost seems like all the work that they do is because they want to get a conviction, right? And that's based on hopefully what they're working with, and not just out of bad faith,
Yeah, but there's also, there's pride wrapped in it. There's maybe a desire to get promotion. There's all sorts of
promotion, right? There's celebrations, of course. Yeah. All that I think comes to play. Those are real. Those are real. We got to recognize that those are real circumstances that unfortunate defendants are facing. That times they don't have all the evidence of guilt, but because you may have an overreaching detective, investigator, prosecutor, that they'll make that puzzle fit. They'll put that piece of the puzzle to make it fit. Even if they got to squeeze it and, cut the edges, move the edges, they'll make it fit. And unfortunately, it's enough to get that conviction. You think twice, like, man, doesn't make sense that they got a conviction on this because so many other factors were missing. But sometimes it's how they articulate these words without having to fully explain it. For example, a generic statement, Diamond Street and 18th Street are rivals. Well, technically, yeah, because most gangs are rivals to each other, right? But they're not everyday rivals. You're not going to find 18th Street looking for Diamond Street on a daily basis or vice versa because they're a distance, right? Especially now, there's 18th Street near Diamond Street in the downtown area, but not in the west side. They're not, this incident happened in the west side, for example, like 8 miles away from Diamond Street. That does not exist at 18th Street, right? So technically a cop saying the rivals is true, but it's not the full factual truth. And so you got to be able to explain that 8 miles away is far in gang culture. It's almost unlikely that these two gangs would even interact, right? So those are the detailed pieces that someone like myself must articulate and hopefully put that in perspective, and the jury not to just run that they're rivals because they're gangs.
Well, Martin, my friend, you brought it today. Thank you so much for the fascinating discussion. We really appreciate you being generous with your time.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope that this hits people. Hopefully it educates people. Hopefully it motivates people to make themselves available. You know what I'm saying? Because I do believe, just like that one kid who was not the strongest academically kid, was one of my best tutors. I feel that each of us could be that best tutor, right? In the capacity that we play, whether we're advocates, policymaker advocates, churchgoers, community goers, coaches, concern for our community, that we could be that kid who with our little power, with our little will, that we could be effective. So thank you again for that opportunity.
Hey, Dion, before I get your take on that intense journey into the center of gang culture, I think we better clarify something for our listeners that we just sort of dropped in there without a reference. And that is, we're talking about Danny Popeye Roman. He was a Mexican Mafia member who continued to run a crime syndicate for many years from behind bars. And the way he did this is that his daughter served as a surrogate, and she ran her organization out of a South Central LA butcher shop. In 2019, Danny Roman was actually murdered in prison by Mexican Mafia members. And, interestingly enough, his grandson is an actor who actually co-starred with Shia LaBeouf in a movie called The Tax Collector. So with that said, Dion, give me your thoughts on that wild ride that Martine took us on.
It was Mehul. It was definitely a wild ride, and I kind of had a feeling that Martine might have had some kind of contact with Danny Popeye Roman.
Yeah.
So there's no surprise there, and I thought it was interesting that he didn't give us a ton of information, hedged his bet a little bit. I probably
smart man.
I would do the same thing. But I think if I were to sum up our interview with him, I think it would be one word, and that would be honesty. That was probably the most sincere and honest look inside this culture 360 degrees, without a doubt.
Yeah, for sure. I was speaking to another gang expert at the jail one time, and he was kind of explaining, this idea of gang enhancements. And my experience is that they just seem to throw that on every case. And, as Martine kind of said, you could, if you wanted to create a narrative, you could paint anybody as a gang member. But in terms of an enhancement, it was once explained to me this way. Let's say you have two male gang members in the same gang. One of them basically has an affair with the other one's girlfriend. So there's cheating. The one who's cheated on kills the other gang member. Is that murder really gang related? It's really not. It's about infidelity. But you can see how a prosecutor would want to make that a gang enhancement. But that doesn't in any way benefit the gang. That was a personal dispute with two people who happen to be gang members. So as Martine was saying, if you're bringing in all this evidence of somebody being a gang member, you're just going to kind of tilt the mind of the jury about the rest of the facts in the case.
Yeah, a couple things on that. One, I thought he explained it really well, and broke it down in its simplest terms and how you can take advantage, prosecutors can take advantage of this. And because someone has a gang tattoo or maybe was arrested at a prior crime, does that make everything that they do going forward gang related, to your point, right?
Yeah.
And then one of the things that you did early on when we started this podcast is you kind of broke that gang enhancement down. It's always kind of stuck with me that you can stack, have a simple crime, but you can stack 10, 11 other additional crimes on there, just like you broke down. And this is how you get, the overcrowding, and we can go down a whole nother rabbit hole discussing all this. But I think that these things need to be separated and defined. I'm not saying, hey, let these guys out. They're all angels.
Right. Of course.
Listen, let's just get them for the crime that they committed. Right.
I mean, my gosh, Martine was saying that, when he was younger, just based on where he lived, how he dressed, who he associated with, I mean, he would be considered gang affiliated. That's a great point. I mean, are you going to all of a sudden look at someone's zip code, because they're in Boyle Heights or something like that and say, oh, you got to be a gang? So it's very easy to get, arrested and sort of wrongly charged or something. But man, now if you're pegged as a gang member on top of that, that could have, forget about the gang violence in Martine's neighborhood. I shouldn't say forget about it, but my gosh, just getting jammed up like that could have ruined his life as well.
Yeah, and then you're taking, there's obviously a lot of talk about rehabilitation. You're taking a lot of those opportunities off the table if you're just going to, slam them with all this stuff. You're never going to give them a chance to, learn from mistake or, go through a program or anything like that to get right. If you're just going to just add all the stuff on there, never give them an opportunity to get out of jail because you're hitting them with, like I said, 7 or 8 different additional crimes.
So I think very similar to DNA. Like Martine was saying, some of the attorneys he works with, they don't know anything about this gang culture. So I thought that was interesting as well, is the way that he is acting basically like you, going in there and kind of coaching these guys up and saying, this is how this stuff works. Yeah. So for example, a narrative being told by a DNA analyst can be very compelling because it's scientific. There's hardcore evidence. And if the defense attorney doesn't know any better, it's hard to sort of tell another narrative or poke holes in it. Same thing with gangs. I mean, you can't just read in a book and become a gang expert. Although it sounds like some of the law enforcement gang experts were attempting that. So again, I mean, without experts of any type in the criminal justice system, man, oh man, there's really danger.
Yeah, I think that you can tell that the prosecutors really lean on this. So they get this guy in, they start reading his rap sheet, he's gang, and then they've just branded him that way and not actually looking at the specific crime. Or am I off track there?
No, I think you're 100% right. And Luckily, there has been a little bit of change in California, as Martine alluded to. But it sounds like, as with any rule, it sounds like prosecutors are trying to go around that rule a little bit. I remember Martine at one time, I talked to him a number of months ago. I saw him at the jail, and he was saying that really, as a result of the enhancements not being used and abused as much, he's actually not doing as much work, in California. So there is some change on the horizon. We'll see how long that lasts and how long it takes for the loopholes to take charge. But, as always, Dion, that was a lot of fun and educational. And listeners, we hope that you feel the same way. And we thank you so much for your support and your follows and your comments on social media. And if you want to see what Martine is up to on Instagram, you can follow him at Flores Martin M. That's FLORES MARTINM. And of course, please follow us at Crime Redefined. So be well, everyone, and please check out all of our past catalog. We look forward to bringing you more dynamic guests in the near future.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.